3 pharmacies slammed their heavy glass doors in his face, muttering corporate policies and ghost-tier insurance rejections, while his mother gasped for air in the back of a bullet-ridden Lincoln Navigator. He brought a loaded gun to the 4th counter, expecting absolute submission. Instead, a heavy-set night clerk looked straight down the barrel of a polished steel 9mm, slid the medication across the scratched laminate, and told him no. The rain over downtown Chicago didn't fall. It hammered. It turned the asphalt of Elm Street into a black mirror, reflecting the frantic strobe of amber construction lights and the burning xenon headlights of a idling, midnight black 2024 Mercedes Maybach. Inside the Maybach, the air smelled of stale leather, cold sweat, and iron. Beatrice Moretti's chest hitched. A wet, rattling wheeze tore through her 70-year-old throat, echoing off the custom mahogany paneling. "Marco!" she rasped, her hand knotted with arthritis and pale as skim milk, clawing at the sleeve of her cashmere coat. "My chest, it's like lead, Joey. It's heavy." "Almost there, Ma," Marco Moretti muttered. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the low, gravel-grinding register that made grown men in custom Italian suits empty their bladders into their loafers, without a word being spoken. He kept his eyes locked on the road, though the windshield wipers were fighting a losing war against the deluge. 3 pharmacies, 3 corporate-backed monoliths with glowing neon crosses outside. At St. Jude's Health Mart on Michigan Avenue, the young 20-something tech behind the high bulletproof glass had looked at Marco's bloodshot eyes, looked at the black eye patch of a man standing guard behind him, and instantly panicked. He didn't even look at the digital script. He just tapped his keyboard twice, shook his head, and mumbled, "Systems down for routine audit. Try a hospital." At Crosstown Drugs on Wabash, the middle-aged pharmacist took the tablet, glanced at the restricted narcotic cardiac compound, a specialized European import, meant to keep fluid out of failing heart valves, and slammed the sliding drawer shut. "That script is flagged under a federal audit hold. I can't fill it. If I touch that, DEA is up my ass before sunrise. Get out." And at Vanguard Apothecary on Grand Avenue, they didn't even open the security slat. A private security guard pressed his palm against the glass, shaking his head with a practiced, bored smirk, mouthing closed for inventory. Now the digital dashboard of the Maybach flashed a blinking red warning. Critical oxygen deficit. Marco didn't slow down for the red light at the intersection of Elm and 4th. He blew right through it, his tires screaming in hydroplane agony as he whipped the heavy sedan into a sharp, reckless right turn. Crunch. A metallic screech tore through the cabin. The Maybach's front passenger fender clipped the rear quarter panel of a battered, rusted-out 2012 Honda Civic parked halfway up the curb, sending the smaller car skidding sideways into a rusted municipal trash can. "Damn it!" Marco slammed his palm against the steering wheel, the horn blaring a single furious note into the wet night. He didn't care about the insurance. He didn't care about the dent. He threw the Maybach into park, shoved the door open, and stepped straight into the freezing, ankle-deep gutter water. Rain soaked his tailored wool trousers instantly, but he didn't feel it. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He yanked the rear door open. Beatrice's head had slumped sideways against the headrest. Her lips were turning a frightening, bruised violet. "Ma, look at me. Stay with me." Marco's fingers trembled just for a fraction of a second, a microscopic tremor that no soldier in his syndicate would have ever believed possible. He scooped her up in his arms, her slight, fragile frame feeling terrifyingly light, like dry twigs bound in silk. He looked up. Right across the narrow, rain-slicked sidewalk sat Abernathy and Sons Apothecary. A flickering, buzzing neon sign hummed in the window. Open. The paint on the wooden door was peeling, and the brass door handle was tarnished green with age. It was an independent holdout in a neighborhood that had long since surrendered to chain stores and luxury condominiums. Marco didn't walk, he charged. He kicked the wooden door open with the heel of his Bruno Magli shoe. The brass bell above the door gave a pathetic, tinny jingle. The interior smelled of old paper, dried chamomile, and industrial bleach. Behind the high wooden dispensing counter stood a woman. She was heavy-set, her broad frame swallowed by an oversized forest green lab coat that strained at the buttons across her stomach. Her dark brown hair was hastily twisted up into a messy bun, with a yellow 2 pencil skewered through it, a few damp strands clinging stubbornly to the side of her flushed, rain-spattered cheek. She was wiping down the laminate counter with a damp yellow sponge when the door slammed back against the wall with a force that made the hanging glass apothecary jars rattle dangerously on their wire hooks. She looked up, her dark, sharp eyes blinking against the sudden intrusion. She didn't drop the sponge. Marco reached the counter in 3 strides. He planted both palms on the worn wood, leaning in until his face was inches from the protective plexiglass barrier. Though here, unlike the corporate stores, the barrier was only half height, topped with an open wooden pass-through tray. "My mother," Marco said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with raw, unfiltered terror disguised as absolute menace. "She needs this script filled right now. No questions, no waiting." He slapped a folded piece of heavy hospital parchment onto the wooden tray, alongside a thick stack of banded $100 bills, at least $10,000 cash, bursting out of a white paper bank band. The woman, her name tag, pinned crookedly to her lapel, read Clara, looked down at the money. Then she looked up at the cash. Then she looked straight into Marco's dark, hollow, unblinking eyes. She didn't flinch, not an inch. Hazel slowly dropped her yellow sponge into the plastic bucket beneath the counter. She picked up the hospital script with fingers that were steady, unhurried, and entirely unimpressed by the thick brick of cash sitting inches from her knuckles. She adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses on the bridge of her nose, squinted at the seal, and then looked back up at Marco. "This is a restricted Schedule II cardiac depressant," Hazel said, her voice clear, calm, and carrying an odd, melodic authority that completely ignored the panic, radiating off the most feared man in Illinois. "It requires a physical physician verification signature from an in-network provider registered with the state board. This signature is digital, and the system shows it was flagged for an active financial hold in 3 separate county districts 40 8 hours ago. I don't give a damn about the system, Marco snarled, his hand dipping instinctively beneath his wet coat, his fingers wrapping around the checkered grip of his Smith & Wesson Model 6N86. The steel made a low, ominous scrape against his holster. The system doesn't keep her heart beating. You do. You have the stock in your back room. I checked your inventory manifest online before I turned down this street. Fill it, or I'll pull every shelf off this wall and burn this building to the ground with you inside it. The threat hung in the thick, humid air of the pharmacy. It was a promise backed by 1,000 anonymous graves across the north side. Hazel didn't blink. She didn't reach for a panic button. Instead, she let out a slow, heavy sigh, the kind of sigh a mother gives a toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery aisle. She leaned her heavy forearms against the edge of the counter, tilting her head slightly. "You can pull all the shelves you want, mister," Hazel said, her voice dropping into a flat, immovable register. "And you can wave that shiny little gun around until your knuckles turn white. But I am not filling this script." Marco froze. His finger tightened on the trigger guard inside his coat. The silence in the small shop grew so dense he could hear the steady drip-drip of water leaking from the ceiling tile into a plastic bucket in the corner. "What did you say to me?" Marco whispered, his voice dangerously low. "I said no," Hazel repeated, her dark eyes locking onto his with terrifying, immovable calm. "Because your mother isn't having a standard cardiac arrest, and that medication would kill her within 10 minutes, if her current blood pressure baseline is what I think it is. You brought her to the wrong place, mister, and you're shouting at the wrong person." The air in the pharmacy turned instantly glacial. Outside, a police siren wailed in the far distance, muffled by the relentless sheet of rain. But inside, the only sound was Beatrice's ragged, whistling breath coming from the car, idling at the curb through the open door. Marco didn't pull the gun. That was the first terrifying tell. A lesser man would have drawn iron out of pure defensive reflex when challenged. Marco just stared at her, really stared at her, his mind racing through a maze of calculated violence that suddenly hit a concrete wall. "You think you're playing games with the wrong customer." Marco's voice was a lethal hiss. He leaned over the counter, closing the distance, until he could smell the faint, clean scent of lavender soap and damp wool coming off her oversized lab coat. "My mother is dying in a car, 30 feet from where you're standing. You have 20 seconds to pack those pills into a bag before I vault over this counter and find them myself." Hazel didn't back away. She stood her ground, her substantial frame planting firmly against the back counter as she reached out and deliberately pushed the stack banned $100 bills back across the laminate toward him. "Take your dirty money and your threats back out into the rain," Hazel said, her voice hardening, losing its mild tone and revealing a sharp, cutting edge that caught Marco entirely off guard. "And if you actually care about that old woman out there, instead of your own ego, you'll stop screaming at people who work for a living and listen to me for 5 damn seconds." From the doorway, heavy footsteps crunched on the shattered glass. Felix Rossi stepped into the pharmacy, his broad shoulders filling the entranceway, a 9mm Glock already drawn and hanging casually at his side, rain dripping off the brim of his fedora. "Boss," Felix barked, his eyes darting suspiciously toward Hazel. "We got a tail coming up the block. 2 unmarked cruisers. We gotta move now." Marco didn't look back at Felix. His eyes remained locked on Hazel's face. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a cold, stubborn exhaustion that looked remarkably like his own. "She's a doctor," Marco said softly, testing the weight of the realization. "You didn't look at the script like a clerk. You looked at it like someone who knows pharmacology. I was a chief surgical resident at Mercy General before the hospital board buried my license in a malpractice scandal I didn't cause." Hazel snapped back, her chin lifting defiantly. She reached down, yanked open a bottom drawer beneath the register, and pulled out a plain brown glass bottle with a handwritten white label. "And your mother isn't suffering from coronary artery occlusion. She's suffering from acute digitalis toxicity. Whoever prescribed her that European compound doubled her dosage within the last 48 hours. If I had filled that script just now, her kidneys would have shut down permanently before you reached the highway." Marco's breath caught in his throat. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Digitalis toxicity. Beatrice's private physician was Dr. Alistair Vance, a man Marco paid $50,000 a month to keep his mother alive, a man whose loyalty Marco had never once questioned, because Vance had saved Marco's life during the warehouse ambush 3 years ago. "Vance," Marco muttered, the name tasting like ash and copper in his mouth. "Whoever your doctor is, he's trying to kill her slowly," Hazel said bluntly. She grabbed a small paper cup, filled with a cloudy, amber-tinted liquid, and a sterile dropper from the counter shelf. "This is activated charcoal slurry, combined with a saline flush. It's the only thing that's going to bind the heavy metals in her stomach right now. Take it out to her. Now." Felix raised his Glock slightly, eyeing Hazel with murderous suspicion. "Boss, don't listen to her. It's a trap. She could be working for the outfit on the south side. We take the old lady to the private clinic in Cicero." "Shut up, Felix," Marco snarled without turning around. He reached out across the counter. For the first time in his life, Marco Moretti didn't take something by force. He accepted it. His large, calloused fingers wrapped around the small paper cup. His knuckles brushed against Hazel's warm, steady hand. There was no lightning bolt, no cinematic spark, just the undeniable, grounding warmth of a living human being who wasn't afraid of him. "If she dies," Marco whispered, his voice trembling with a quiet, devastating threat that carried the weight of 1,000 executioners, "I will come back through this door, and I won't ask for medicine. If she dies," Hazel fired back, her dark eyes flashing with equal fury, "it'll be because her son spent too long trying to be a monster instead of listening to a pharmacist." Marco turned on his heel, clutching the paper cup like a holy relic, and sprinted back out into the freezing Chicago rain toward the idling Maybach. Inside the car, Beatrice's eyes were rolling back, her breathing shallow and wet. Marco didn't hesitate. He forced her jaw open, gently, with a tenderness that would have shocked every Kappa Regime in the syndicate, and poured the bitter amber liquid down her throat. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The rain drummed a frantic tattoo against the car roof. Felix stood guard outside, scanning the dark street with his gun drawn. Then Beatrice gagged. A violent spasm racked her thin frame, and she coughed up a dark, foul-smelling fluid onto the leather floor mat. Her chest heaved. A long, deep, rattling breath filled her lungs. She blinked, her vision clearing, and looked up at her son with clouded, lucid eyes. "Marco," she whispered, her voice fragile as spun glass. Where are we?" Marco let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 10 years. His shoulders sagged, the iron rigidness of his posture collapsing into a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He looked back through the rain-streaked window toward the glowing amber light of Abernathy and Sons Apothecary. Hazel was standing behind the glass door, watching them. She hadn't gone back to wiping the counter. She was just standing there in her oversized green lab coat, holding a yellow sponge, watching the most feared man in the city realize that he had just been saved by a plus-size night clerk with a yellow pencil stuck in her hair. Marco reached for his phone, dialing a private encrypted number. "Felix," Marco said, his voice cold, hard and flat as polished granite. "Find out everything there is to know about Dr. Alistair Vance. Every bank account, every offshore wire, every phone call for the last 3 years." "You got it, boss," Felix muttered. "And the girl?" Marco looked back at the glowing window where Hazel had turned around and disappeared into the back shelves of the pharmacy. "Leave her alone," Marco said quietly, sliding his phone back into his coat. "She works for us now." What Marco didn't know, what the hospital files, the police reports, and the syndicate wiretaps had spent 5 years successfully burying, was that Hazel Higgins wasn't just a disgraced former medical resident working a night shift for minimum wage. She was the sole living heir to the Abernathy estate, and the rusty iron safe, bolted to the floor beneath her pharmacy counter, didn't hold expired cough syrup. It held the original federal bank ledger, detailing every single money laundering account the Moretti syndicate had used to buy the city of Chicago, signed 50 years ago by Marco's own father and witnessed by a judge whose granddaughter had just handed Marco a paper cup of charcoal to save his mother's life. To be continued in the next message. The rain had finally slowed to a greasy, dripping mist by 3:15 in the morning, plastering the litter against the curbs of 88th and Racine. Marco's Maybach didn't fit on this street. Its obsidian flanks scraped against the rusted chain-link fence of an abandoned auto body yard as it idled outside a crumbling 3-story brick walk-up where the hallway lights had been smashed out since the Carter administration. Felix killed the engine, but the V12 purred down into a low, menacing growl. He turned around in the passenger seat, his fingers drumming nervously against the leather holster of his Glock. "Boss, I'm telling you, this is a waste of shoe leather," Felix muttered, wiping a streak of condensation off the side window. "The girl's a nobody. She lives in a box above a dry cleaner that smells like burnt perch. If Vance is dirty, we grab Vance. We don't come knocking on a clerk's door in the middle of the night." Because she gave the old lady charcoal. Marco didn't answer. He was staring out at the entrance of the walk-up. A single flickering, incandescent bulb hung over the rotting wooden stoop, casting long, bruised shadows across the concrete. He unbuckled his seatbelt, the metallic click sounding deafening in the quiet cabin. "Wait here." "Marco," I said, "wait here, Felix." The door opened with a heavy, solid thud. Marco stepped out into the damp chill, his tailored wool overcoat brushing against his shins. He climbed the 3 splintered steps of the porch, his hand resting casually inside his coat pocket, wrapped around the checkered grip of his Smith & Wesson. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. The front security door of the tenement had a latch that had been broken off by a crowbar months ago. He pushed it open with his shoulder, the wood groaning in protest as he stepped into the stairwell. The air inside was thick with the scent of boiled cabbage, cheap pine cleaner, and damp plaster. 3rd floor, apartment 3B. He didn't take the stairs. He took them 2 at a time, his boots making a heavy, rhythmic thud against the hollow wooden treads. When he reached the door of 3B, he saw a strip of yellow light leaking out from beneath the crack. He could hear the faint, scratchy sound of a radio playing old vinyl blues. Marco raised his fist and knocked twice. Short, heavy, authoritative. The music stopped instantly. For 5 long seconds, there was absolute silence inside. Then, the sound of a deadbolt sliding back, followed by the rattle of a safety chain. The door opened 4 inches. Hazel stood in the gap. She had traded her oversized green pharmacy lab coat for an old, faded gray college sweatshirt that was a size too small, pulling tight across her full stomach and heavy hips. Her dark hair was still pinned up with that same yellow 2 pencil, though a few more strands had broken loose, curling damply around her forehead. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was holding a mug of steaming black coffee in both hands, her knuckles wrapped around the ceramic for warmth. She looked down at Marco, her dark eyes narrowing with a flash of annoyance rather than fear. "If my mother dies because you forgot to give her the 2nd dose of saline, I'm going to call the cops," Hazel said, her voice flat and steady. Marco didn't move. He stood in the dim, flickering hallway light, his dark overcoat wet at the shoulders, looking down at her with a gaze that had broken syndicate capos and politicians alike. But tonight it just looked tired. "She's resting," Marco said, his voice a low gravel rasp. "Her breathing cleared up 20 minutes after we got to the safe house. Vance is gone. We hit his townhouse in Lincoln Park 20 minutes ago. The safe was open. His passport was missing, and his desk was full of wire receipts from the North Side outfit." Hazel didn't blink. She took a slow sip of her coffee, the steam curling past the rim of her wire-rimmed glasses. "I told you. A man who writes prescriptions like that isn't practicing medicine. He's running an execution ledger." Marco shifted his weight, his broad shoulders filling the narrow hallway. "You knew Vance. You knew his signature. You knew his rotation. And you knew the exact dosage formula for digitalis toxicity off the top of your head, in the middle of a flooded pharmacy, while I was holding a gun to your face. I was a chief surgical resident at Mercy General until the hospital board needed a scapegoat for a botched VIP transplant that happened while I was off shift," Hazel said, her voice dropping a fraction, losing none of its bite. She didn't look away, even when Marco stepped 1 inch closer, invading her personal space. "People like Vance cover up their mistakes by burying the people who ask too many questions. I asked too many questions. They took my license. I took a night shift at Abernathy's so I could afford insulin for my diabetic uncle and keep a roof over my head. End of story." "Nothing is ever the end of the story," Marco said softly. He reached out, not with a weapon, not with violence, but with a slow, deliberate movement. He reached past her shoulder and pushed the apartment door wide open, stepping uninvited across the threshold into her home. The apartment was tiny, smelling of old books and laundry detergent. A single worn-out corduroy sofa sat beneath a smudged front window looking out over the L tracks. Piles of medical journals and pharmaceutical compendiums were stacked neatly against the baseboards like bricks. There was no TV, no luxury, no sign of the kind of money that floated through Marco's world. Hazel didn't try to block him. She just closed the door behind him with a soft click, turned around, and set her coffee mug down on a wobbly wooden side table. "You've got a lot of nerve walking into someone's home at 3 in the morning, Mr. Moretti." "Moretti," Hazel said, turning to face him, crossing her arms over her chest, the grey sweatshirt shifting across her full frame. "Especially when half the cops in Cook County are on your payroll, and the other half are looking for an excuse to put you under the jail." "They aren't looking tonight," Marco said, walking slowly toward the center of her cramped living room. He stopped by a small oak bookshelf, his eyes scanning the titles. Gray's Anatomy, 39th edition, Pathology of the Cardiovascular System, and tucked behind them, a heavy, leather-bound volume with gold leaf peeling off the spine. Abernathy and Sons Ledger, 1974. Marco's hand hovered over the leather spine. The room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You told me your name was Hazel Higgins," Marco whispered, his eyes fixed on the gold-embossed family crest stamped into the leather, the exact same crest that was carved into the mahogany mantelpiece of his late father's study. "It is," Hazel replied, her chin lifting defiantly. "Higgins was my mother's maiden name. She used it when she walked out on the family 30 years ago." "And your grandfather," Marco said, his voice dropping into a dangerous glacial whisper as he turned to face her, his hand resting inches from the leather volume, "was Arthur Abernathy, the federal judge who signed the asset forfeiture warrants that crippled crippled my father's syndicate back in '94, before he mysteriously vanished from his summer home in Lake Geneva." Hazel didn't flinch. She let out a dry, humorless laugh that held no mirth, only a deep, abiding bitterness. "He didn't vanish," Hazel said, her voice hardening like iron. "Your father's enforcers didn't make him disappear either, if that's what you're waiting to hear. He drank himself to death in a motel room in Peoria 5 years later, broke, disgraced, and holding an iron safe full of documents that proved every single dirty land deal, political bribe, and drug route the Moretti family used to build this empire." She walked toward the bookshelf, her heavy footsteps steady against the linoleum floor. She didn't look away from Marco's dark, unblinking stare. She reached out right past his shoulder, grabbed the heavy leather ledger, and slammed it down onto the coffee table with a thud that rattled the empty coffee mug. "You think you walked into that pharmacy tonight by accident?" Hazel asked, her dark eyes flashing with a raw, terrifying intelligence. "You think my grandfather's safe sat under those shelves collecting dust because I didn't know what it was worth? Vance didn't just try to kill your mother because he's on the outfit's payroll, Marco. He tried to kill her because she found out that my grandfather's ledger was still intact, and that I was the one holding the key to every numbered Swiss account your father left behind." Marco stared down at the ledger. The silence in the small apartment was absolute. The radio had stopped playing entirely, leaving only the distant, hollow rumble of an L train rattling across the tracks outside. Every promise made in the shadows of that rain-slicked street had just come home to roost. The counter-girl wasn't a victim. She wasn't a pawn. She was the architect of his reckoning. Before Marco could speak, the floorboards in the hallway groaned. Creak. It wasn't the sound of a casual visitor. It was the precise, heavy, measured step of a trained operative moving in the dark. Felix's voice crackled over the encrypted radio, tucked inside Marco's coat collar, drowned out by the harsh sound of static and a muffled grunt. "Boss, we got company." 3 unmarked sedans just pulled into the alley. There, a sharp, wet crack echoed through the apartment building's hallway. Gunfire. Marco didn't hesitate. In half a second, his Smith & Wesson was out of his holster, the steel catching the dim amber light of the street lamp outside. He grabbed Hazel by the forearm, his grip firm, warm, and utterly unbreakable, yanking her down behind the heavy oak sofa. Just as a burst of submachine gun fire shredded the front door of the apartment, sending splinters of wood and lead flying across the room. The door exploded inward in a storm of jagged splinters and white plaster dust. 2 men in black tactical gear, their faces hidden behind reinforced ceramic balaclavas and night vision goggles, poured through the shattered frame. They weren't street thugs, they were professional cleaners, the elite wet work squad of the South Side outfit, sent to tie up every loose end before sunrise. "Clear." The lead gunman barked, his silenced MP5 sweeping the small living room. Marco didn't wait for them to adjust their sights. Lying flat on the worn linoleum floor behind the sofa, his left arm shielding Hazel's broad back, he raised his Model 686. Bang, bang. 2 deafening gunshots roared inside the cramped apartment, the muzzle flash painting the peeling wallpaper in a brilliant, blinding orange. The lead gunman's visor shattered outward in a spiderweb of red and polycarbonate, his body crashing hard against the coat rack before sliding down into the heap of debris by the ruined door. The second operative pivoted, his weapon swinging toward the sofa. Before he could pull the trigger, Hazel didn't scream. She didn't cower. With a cold, calculated fury that matched Marco's own, she reached out from behind the sofa, grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet that had been sitting on the floor next to her medical bag, and hurled it with terrifying precision straight at the gunman's shins. The heavy iron caught the operative squarely across his ankles. He stumbled forward, his balance ruined just enough. Marco fired a 3rd time. The bullet took the operative clean through the shoulder plate, spinning him around and sending him crashing backward through the open doorway to stairwell, into the dark, empty stairwell. The silence returned instantly, heavier and more suffocating than before. The smell of cordite and burnt gunpowder choked the air, mixing with the scent of stale cabbage and rain. Marco lowered his gun, his chest heaving slightly, though his hands were as steady as anchor chains. He turned his head and looked down at Hazel. She was kneeling behind the sofa, her breathing fast, her face smudged with plaster dust, but her dark eyes were wide, clear, and burning with an adrenaline-fueled defiance that defied every law of nature and survival. "You throw a mean skillet," Marco murmured, a faint humorless ghost of a smile touching the corner of his lips. "I told you," Hazel whispered back, her voice shaking with residual fury as she wiped a streak of soot off her cheek with the back of her hand. "You walked into the wrong pharmacy, Mr. Moretti." Marco reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently wrapping around her wrist, pulling her up from the floor. He didn't let go of her hand. He kept his fingers locked around hers as he stepped over the splintered remains of the front door. Looking out into the dark, smoking hallway where Felix was already limping up the stairs, with his Glock smoking in his hand, a bloody gash across his temple. "Boss!" Felix panted, leaning against the bullet-riddled wall. "We got more coming up the fire escape. We need to move." Now, Marco looked down at Hazel. Then he looked back at the heavy leather Abernathy ledger, still resting safely on the coffee table. "We aren't running, Felix," Marco said, his voice dropping into that dark, terrifying register that made every man in the syndicate obey without a second thought. "We're going to my car, and the lady is coming with us." Hazel didn't pull her hand away from his. She reached down, picked up her heavy leather medical bag in her free hand, and tucked the yellow 2-pencil back securely into her dark, messy bun. "Lead the way, boss," she said. "What happens when the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago discovers his entire empire belongs to the woman he tried to intimidate? Read the thrilling conclusion and find out how the Moretti Syndicate falls. Drop your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for the next chapter.